In this video, what we're going to take you through is the emphasis of, or the effect rather, of body position on the muscles that are working at different points in the range of motion on a lat pull down, or whatever you want to call it, any type of pull down, okay? So what we're using here, this handle is their initial, like the main brand is called MAG, M-A-G, but basically these types of grips are really nice for work in the back. So if you do have access to them, they're excellent. We'll make some separate videos on why they can be so useful. But in this case, it's a type of close grip pull down that we're doing, and there's a slight angle to it. So these grips in general, they allow you to place the hand over the top, but you've also got this support on the palm side. So the wrists don't really do much, but you can apply force inwards and get really stable, and it feels quite nice overall for pull down and rowing variations. But in this case, what we want to show you is kind of the standard pull down. So if Paddy sits down, do a couple of reps of the pull down, I want to kind of talk you through some of the features so that we get a better understanding of the anatomy, okay? So what's happening here is he's coming up roughly to a straight arm position overhead, so the shoulders in close to full flexion. In general, when the arms are supinated overhead like this, it's going to be harder to get into full flexion because the relative position of the shoulder. So what he's going to do then, as he pulls down and keeping the body strict, he's pulling down to the point where the arms are coming down by the sides of the body. So that line of force there relative to the shoulder, it's coming down straight through the cable. That's your line of force, and there's this moment arm between that and the actual shoulder joint itself. Now the thing to understand there is that as this arm comes closer and closer down to the side of the body, the challenge reduces and reduces and reduces, because it's basically just pulling up through the shoulder, and there's not as much of a challenge on shoulder extension down in that bottom position when you get right to the bottom. So you're thinking about the relationship between the cable and the shoulder, but you're also thinking about the position of the shoulder itself, because it's kind of just pulling his arm up. And obviously, if I try to just pull his arm like that, it's not adding that much of a challenge, because I'm just putting straight up through the arm, so it's kind of easy for him to maintain that position. However, if he pulls down to the bottom and he starts to lean back, now what happens is that line of force is actually still perpendicular to the shoulder or to the upper arm. So as he leans back, it's actually quite difficult down the bottom. So it's not coming closer to the shoulder joint like it was previously. And now you've got this increased challenge in that top position, or in that bottom position rather. So it kind of turns it from the top position where we're getting that pull down, we're getting that full stretch, to the bottom position where you've actually got an additional challenge in the shortened range of the lats and the shoulder extensors, along with the actual scapular muscles responsible for shoulder retraction. So you can take a break there for a second, Paddy. So if you think about what's actually going on there, guys, you have to think about the anatomy that's actually at play. So in general, when we're doing pull down type exercises, we're not going to be working the shoulder or the scapular retractors, so the upper back muscles responsible for retraction. We're not going to be working them that much, because the direction of the line of force is against shoulder extension primarily. Okay, and for the most part, the challenge is going to be greatest in the middle of the range of motion rather than down here at the bottom. So in general, we're going to get that type of drop off in resistance as we come towards the bottom of the range of motion on a standard pull down. So as you begin to lean back then, you're shortening the lats further, because as we extend the spine, we shorten the lats because of their attachments. And then you're going to be changing the line of force so that it's now pulling the arm forward, so there's a greater moment arm from there to the shoulder, because with the resistance pulling forward through my arm, the moment arm to the shoulder, or to shoulder extension, is now the same distance more or less between the line here on my arm as I'm pulling the cable and the actual shoulder. So there's a big shoulder flexion moment arm there, because it wants to pull my arm forward, okay? So that's the way you want to think about it. Whereas when we're pulling like this, the shoulder extension moment arm begins to decrease quite a bit down the bottom, because the shoulder joint is here and we've got this line of force here. So as a result, there's this distance versus this very large distance. So that can help you to understand why the more you lean back, the harder the bottom of the range of motion is actually going to be. And that's also manifest in terms of the way people generally perform chin-up type exercises. So if you see people perform chin-ups, if someone's really strong, they pull down and they can arch their back and they can keep, you know, their chest up close to the bar. Whereas if you see someone that's maybe just aiming for maximum reps, they're generally going to pull themselves in as close as they can to the bar with their chin poking up over it, because what you see, what happens then is that as the bar comes closer to the shoulder, you get a reduction in the moment arm and hence a reduction in the challenge to the shoulder extensor muscles. So in general, if you're doing an exercise where you're leaning back at the bottom, it's going to be harder in that position. Now, does that mean that that's actually desirable or necessary in this case? Not necessarily. It just means that it's harder at that point. So if you have someone that you're trying to get them to, you know, feel their lats more during the exercise, or trying to feel more of the back muscles working in the bottom position, then you might use something like a slight lean back to adjust that exercise. So I suppose the key message to get out of this is that what we're working depends not just on what we call the exercise. So a pull down is not just a pull down. It also depends on the position of the body. So one more thing I want to show you is, Paddy, if you sit down again and just kind of maintain that top position. If Paddy's in the top position here, right, so I see that he's in a supinated position. So generally when you're supinated, the shoulder's going to be more externally rotated. And when the shoulder's more externally rotated, it's harder to get the arm overhead. Whereas if I twist my palm forward and I leave it there, or even just facing inward, it's easier to get that arm overhead, okay? So in general, I'm not going to force him, you know, into that overhead position here. But if you wanted to get someone into a position where you're training more of that extreme shoulder flexion range of motion, what you might do is get them to really focus on bracing their abs here. Because if he braces his abs and thinks about pushing his chest forward, then now what happens is the arms come further overhead. Whereas if he leans back at the starting position, now we're starting from less shoulder flexion. So if you look there, you have maybe 120, 130 degrees of shoulder flexion. So now we're not working the extreme of that range. So you can let that down. That's something you might spot in your clients. If you're coaching clients and maybe again it's someone who has a history of shoulder pain or history of a shoulder injury or surgery or something like that, or they've previously reported very poor shoulder mobility, you might want to initially, you know, have a look at what their range of motion is like. So if I say, Paddy, lift your left arm up overhead for me, I can see that, yep, he's got the requisites to be able to do that exercise, no problem. You know, he's able to reach that arm overhead just fine. Whereas if I tell Paddy to do the same thing and he's reaching out to here, what I can see is that, okay, he's only got maybe 110, 120 degrees of shoulder flexion. And I say, you know, Paddy, do you mind if I just pull another bit? And you know, it feels like it's real stiff. He's not able to go much further. I don't want to use an exercise like this to drag him into a range of motion that feels uncomfortable. But what I could do is say, okay, Paddy, I want you to grab onto the weights for me there. And now I want you to lean back in the starting position. And now we've got a starting position where Paddy's actually able to get into that starting position despite his poor shoulder range of motion. So if I was coaching someone like that and we're, you know, coaching in like a rehab capacity or someone who has an injury like that, you could provide a bit of support here at the chest and just get them to do the exercise just like that. And then when you are letting them go back up, you give a bit of support so that they're not being dragged into that range of motion that's uncomfortable for them. So that's just some of the considerations that you might want to have a think about there. The range of motion assessment, it's not a necessary thing for every client, but again, it's about personalization. So if you have a client who's coming to you, history of shoulder pain, previous surgery, something along those lines, these things are not rare at all, then you might want to just have a quick look. You know, can I just have a look at your range of motion, get them to put their arms overhead. You know, what you might see is that they're able to put their arms up, but they're actually leaning back loads into it. So that might tell you that they have a bit of a shoulder flexion range of motion deficit. So remember, in summary, a pull down is not a pull down. We change the muscles that we're working relatively depending on where our body actually is in relation to the machine. Have a think about the relationship between that line of force and the joint axis of interest. In this case, it was the line of force of the cable and the joint axis of the shoulder. And we saw that when we're pulling straight down, the moment arm reduces down here and hence the challenge to the shoulder muscles reduces. Whereas as we lean back, it gets more challenging. And then finally, have a think about your client's capacity in terms of their own range of motion that they have available and the changes that you could potentially make to the exercises that you're building for them in order to personalize for that individual. So hopefully that gives you guys some things to think about and to apply to the clients that you're working with.